An unexplainable quietness suddenly enveloped the royal residence, catching everyone within the walls off guard. Without warning, the meticulously planned royal itinerary ground to a halt, prompting top-tier assistants to wipe their schedules clean. As confidential advisors gathered behind locked doors, hushed rumors began racing down corridors that had seen centuries of crown dilemmas. A monumental event had transpired, positioning King Charles at the center of a forthcoming declaration destined to leave the British public utterly breathless. Make sure to hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another breakdown as we dissect what this truly means for the monarchy's future. For a period of days, an illusion of normalcy was carefully maintained by the household. Every public statement felt serene. Each timeline seemed perfectly orchestrated, and the wording chosen was remarkably, perhaps excessively, precise. Yet, beneath this immaculate facade, an unsettling reality was quietly taking shape. Whispers from within indicated that the sovereign's daily log was facing sudden rewrites, appointments were being pushed back silently, and high-ranking officials were slipping into unlisted consultations. This was far from a state of hysteria. It was something far more calculated. Deep orchestration. When the crown begins orchestrating behind closed doors, a singular truth remains. The populace is on the verge of discovering a reality the institution has been managing internally for quite some time. Through personal ailments, immense strain, internal family friction, and unrelenting societal scrutiny, King Charles had continuously borne the immense burden of the monarchy. This time, however, internal voices intimated that the discourse had transcended isolated incidents, solitary public engagements, or demanding weeks. The core of the conversation had shifted to the viability of his sovereign future. To what extent could he press onward? And how much further could a sense of obligation drive a leader already weighed down by physical challenges and historical mandates? Furthermore, who would shield the crown if the monarch decided to decelerate from the relentless cadence that had characterized his time on the throne? The veil of confidentiality grew denser as internal advisors began restricting the flow of information across the royal estate. Echoes of the situation reached political circles, while media specialists covering the crown picked up on subtle shifts, leaving even traditionally well-informed sources met with a wall of deliberate silence. That very muteness transformed into the most powerful statement imaginable. Standing on the precipice of a monumental choice capable of restructuring its upcoming era, the institution chose absolute discretion over premature commentary. What followed was the most jarring revelation of all. Figures embedded deep within the royal framework indicated that Charles was not acting on a whim of passing sentimentality. Rather, this was a profoundly intimate choice matured over numerous months. It was an equilibrium struck between institutional obligation, historical legacy, public fidelity, and the impending destiny of William's position. The sovereign was doing more than drafting a speech. He was steering the populace toward a recalibration of their expectations, a fundamental tilt in the crown's center of gravity, and arguably the most transparent indicator that the monarchy was already calculating its path forward. What seemed like a flash announcement was actually the culmination of half a year of hushed dialogues, grueling trade-offs, and a tomorrow that had been meticulously mapped out behind the fortress walls. To the outside world, the sovereign appeared entirely resolute in maintaining his path over the preceding months. Behind the curtain, however, accounts indicate that Charles was grappling with dilemmas far grander than daily institutional choreography. While the state required unwavering certainty and the populace craved predictability, the monarch found himself facing a choice that no ruler ever desires to confront. This pressure had been mounting imperceptibly, manifested not through singular dramatic episodes, but through dozens of minor indicators deciphered by royal analysts. A slight reduction in public appearances here, a quiet reallocation of duties there, an official statement delivered with uncharacteristic hesitation. What the public perceived as methodical governance was felt within the machinery as a far weightier reality. Having dedicated his entire existence to inheriting the throne, King Charles now found himself at the peak of his journey, yet forced to ration every single engagement, meeting, and tour against the unyielding boundaries of physical stamina, time, and sovereign accountability. Insiders noted that top-tier consultants were no longer merely organizing calendars. They were evaluating sheer endurance. They questioned how a system built entirely on the concept of unyielding permanence could retain its equilibrium when its ultimate figurehead required a preservation of his physical power. This line of inquiry was incredibly sensitive, nearly unspeakable, because it struck at the absolute core vulnerability of any royal court, a leadership vacuum of certainty. The institution possesses the resilience to withstand public controversy, intense disapproval, and even the exposure of intimate domestic fractures to the global gaze. What it cannot easily endure, however, is ambiguity regarding who shoulders the ultimate responsibility when that weight becomes too overwhelming to bear alone. At this critical juncture, the positioning of Prince William took on unprecedented significance. Sources reported that the Prince of Wales was being integrated into far more profound policy discussions, functioning not merely as a figurehead, but as an essential institutional anchor. His expanding profile provided reassurance to the administrative framework, offering the palace crucial breathing room through his dependable public execution of duties. Concurrently, it highlighted an unspoken reality that few cared to voice. The next era was no longer a distant prospect. It was advancing rapidly, condensed into every passing briefing, every gathering, and every executive choice. According to observers privy to the palace atmosphere, Charles sought neither theatrics nor public alarm. His objective was flawless organization. He recognized that any declaration regarding his sovereign path would reverberate far beyond his own life, directly impacting William, Catherine, the legislature, the global commonwealth, and every citizen who viewed the throne as an anchor of national permanence. Consequently, the orchestration of timing became an area of intense internal deliberation. A premature disclosure risked sparking national anxiety over a systemic breakdown, whereas excessive delay could paint the palace as caught off guard. Thus, Charles navigated a razor-thin line separating historical duty from physical reality, seeking a structured transition rather than a capitulation, a method to shield the crown without masking the reality that the sovereign was vulnerable to human frailties. Amidst this internal negotiation, the historic message took form. Fueled by an undeniable truth, the monarchy was adapting for an impending reality, arriving far quicker than anticipated. The moment Charles began assessing his sovereign path, the spotlight naturally converged on a single individual. Prince William had dedicated decades to preparing for this ultimate accountability, yet theoretical training and actual execution are seldom identical. All at once, the successor found himself positioned closer to the epicenter of governance than ever before. Throughout the majority of his existence, William occupied a unique position, persistently vital, constantly observed, and universally expected to eventually ascend the throne. Yet, a comfortable buffer always existed between future inheritance and present reality. That buffer evaporated the instant consultations regarding Charles's path intensified. What once resembled a chapter reserved for a distant future was suddenly bleeding into the immediate present, its immense weight becoming impossible to disregard with every passing week. Accounts from within the institution suggested that William's administrative footprint expanded significantly as anxieties regarding the king's physical capacity persisted. An increasing volume of state documents found their way to his desk. His attendance became mandatory for key briefings, and his viewpoint guided major outcomes. This evolution materialized not through grandiose pronouncements, but via a seamless, piecemeal reallocation of statecraft, the exact kind of operational shift that denotes long-term foresight well ahead of any public confirmation. Discerning analysts noted that the Prince of Wales had transitioned from merely symbolizing the tomorrow of the crown to actively anchoring its today. This elevation in systemic authority naturally brought an intensification of public evaluation. Every engagement, press release, and subtle expression was dissected for indicators of the impending transition. While societal faith in William remained robust, that trust alone could not alleviate the monumental pressure bearing down on him. Royal history is filled with heirs awaiting their destiny, yet few were forced to steer through such a critical transition, while the global community continuously debated the longevity of a reigning king. Sustaining him throughout this period was Catherine, whose ascending prominence silently reinforced the narrative of institutional continuity that the court so critically required. In tandem, they offered a portrait of dependability amidst a sea of transition, providing crown loyalists with an invaluable asset during a period of rampant conjecture. Absolute poise. Insiders noted that senior members of the dynasty increasingly coalesced around this joint image, fully aware that societal faith would hinge not just on the choices made by Charles, but on the visible readiness of his successors. Concurrently, behind closed doors, operational plotting reportedly shifted into high gear, not as a panicked reaction to an emergency, but as a systematic preparation for looming possibilities. This distinction was paramount. The crown could under no circumstances permit itself to be caught flat-footed. Every dialogue, administrative brief, and tactical meeting mirrored an acute understanding that historical shifts can occur with startling velocity. William comprehended this reality better than anyone, steering clear of any desire for premature authority while ensuring he was fully prepared to step forward should institutional necessity dictate it. Yet such preparation demands a profound personal toll. As William stepped closer to the core of institutional governance, escaping the suffocating weight of public anticipation became an impossibility. The populace sought comfort, the administrative machine demanded permanence, and the successor himself was left navigating inquiries he could never openly address. This rising prominence of William, however, only amplified a far more fundamental question. What exact reality was Charles preparing to disclose to his people? When the historic pronouncement finally went public, even the most veteran royal commentators found themselves reeling from the gravity of the text. This was no routine administrative update. It was a profound testament concerning the absolute destiny of the crown, instantly rewriting the entire national discourse. The pronouncement resonated with immense historical weight. After weeks of a nation yearning for transparency, the palace delivered a clarity that carried profound structural implications. Charles did not deliver his message as a leader seeking public pity. He spoke with the absolute gravity of a monarch aware that every single syllable would be scrutinized, measured, and etched into history. Reports indicated the message was meticulously calibrated to pacify public anxiety while simultaneously adapting the populace to a recalibrated institutional tempo, one where sovereign obligation endures, albeit in a structure vastly different from what the populace had grown accustomed to. The subsequent fallout was instantaneous. Legislative leaders offered measured, dignified responses, while media analysts raced to decipher the subtext of every phrase. Internal court figures sought to distinguish between genuine reassurance and profound disclosure. Was this merely a logistical reorganization of workload, a deeper indicator regarding the king's operational future, or the opening public phase of a systemic transition the court had been mapping out in total privacy for months? The surrounding ambiguity rendered the moment incredibly volatile, primarily because the elements Charles chose to omit felt just as monumental as the details he explicitly shared. Across the geography of the nation, the visceral impact was swift and profound. Loyalists detected immense personal sacrifice, detractors perceived systemic fragility, and traditionalists recognized the strain of duty under pressure. For a vast majority, the disclosure brought a poignant realization. The ruler who had waited a lifetime to claim the crown was now compelled to insulate it under conditions no one could have anticipated. This was far from a moment of pure triumph. It was a sovereignty shadowed by physical limitations, an authority defined by human boundaries, and a life of public service evaluated by its profound personal cost. Inevitably, the exact inquiries palace strategists anticipated began to surface. What were the direct consequences for the line of succession? What exact degree of state governance would William now inherit? Would Catherine's institutional footprint expand even further? Could the administrative machine guarantee the global commonwealth, the legislature, and the citizenry that systemic permanence remained uncompromised? The palace apparatus acted swiftly to broadcast an aura of serenity, utilizing precise language to assert that institutional continuity was entirely protected. Nevertheless, official reassurances carry finite weight when the populace intuitively senses that a foundational royal epoch is shifting right beneath them. Global news networks captured the disclosure within mere moments. Front-page features flashed across hemispheres, converting a localized palace briefing into a global phenomenon centered on authority, legacy, and the vulnerable human condition existing behind majestic duties. The monumental weight of the event was undeniable. Charles had done more than just brief his people. He had unlatched the entryway to the next era of the monarchy, and once that threshold was crossed, no amount of elegant prose could ever fully seal it again. Yet, while the broader public fixated on the broadcast itself, internal operators were focusing their gaze on a completely different metric: the immediate responses of those residing within the king's closest circle. Within the private confines of the royal estate, the announcement unleashed an emotional wave that outsiders would rarely be permitted to witness. For certain individuals, it brought profound melancholy. For others, an immediate call to operational duty. And for a select inner circle, it signaled the dawn of an entirely unmapped era. William's personal reaction, according to individuals familiar with the internal palace climate, lacked the theatricality that the public might assume. It was characterized by an immense sense of control, stability, and an almost agonizing level of composure, which is precisely why it carried such profound weight. The Prince of Wales recognized that his father's choice extended far beyond a personal health matter. It bore the entire weight of the monarchy, the anxieties of a population, and the accumulated pressure of a dynasty that had learned repeatedly that private suffering transforms into historic legacy when it involves a sovereign. William had dedicated his life to institutional duty, but this moment was entirely different. This was historical responsibility rushing toward him with undeniable momentum. The position of Catherine proved equally foundational. Internal briefings indicated that she provided a form of support that required no public fanfare to be profoundly effective. She functioned as a tranquil anchor at a time when the dynasty required poise just as much as tactical maneuvering. Her authority was derived not from overt decrees, but from an unyielding steadiness. And within the crucible of a royal dilemma, such steadiness transforms into its own unique form of power. To William, she offered psychological equilibrium. To the institution, she represented seamless continuity. And to the populace, she became a core element of the silent guarantee that the impending chapter would be handled with meticulous care. Senior dynastic figures similarly grasped the absolute gravity of the moment. The historic disclosure compelled them to dissolve minor internal frictions and unite completely behind Charles. Regardless of past domestic disputes, the survival of the institution remained paramount. This represents the foundational, unyielding mandate of the House of Windsor. Whenever the crown faces exposure, individual sentiments must instantly surrender. Behind closed doors, quiet reflections occurred regarding Charles's prolonged path to the sovereign throne. The decades spent in waiting, the public disapproval endured, the demanding inception of his sovereignty, and the harsh truth that his era as king was being defined by forces no human could have completely anticipated. Even the internal domestic staff felt the profound atmospheric shift. Those who had navigated historical marriages, passings, milestones, public trials, and eras of transition sensed a fundamental alteration in the air. The environment was not defined by systemic collapse, but rather by an overwhelming sense of historical solemnity. Public manifestations of fealty took on heightened importance, where carefully selected phrases from dynastic members carried deep strategic meaning, and every visible display of solidarity was decoded as a component of a larger narrative. The crown would not fracture under the weight of ambiguity. Yet beneath this veneer of absolute loyalty, tactical plotting progressed without interruption. The impending epic of sovereign life was no longer an ideological concept. It was actively being structured, insulated, and quietly pulled into the present. The disclosure had stirred profound sentiment, but sentiment alone could not guide the monarchy forward. Structural execution had to follow. Hard choices required finalization, and those positioned closest to Charles understood that once the global community had processed his words, nothing within the palace walls could ever return to the status quo. As the initial emotional wave receded and global headlines saturated the media landscape, public focus gravitated toward the enduring ramifications of Charles's monumental broadcast. Long before ascending to the sovereign position, Charles had spent half a century preparing for a destiny that many assumed would encapsulate his entire existence. Now, as the populace digested his stunning disclosure, individuals began analyzing the historic path that had guided him to this profound intersection of history. For the vast majority of his life, Charles existed within the holding pattern of anticipation. He was the successor, compelled to master public restraint, the prince who shouldered immense expectation long before he ever wielded authentic sovereign authority, a man evaluated for what he might eventually represent decades before he was given the opportunity to represent it. This protracted apprenticeship fundamentally molded his character, hardening certain facets while refining others, ultimately imbuing his eventual sovereignty with a unique emotional complexity. When he finally claimed the throne, it was not the dawn of a youthful ruler's ascent, but rather the ultimate realization of a lifetime dedicated to an institutional duty that materialized late in life and demanded his absolute everything. This reality explains why the broadcast resonated so deeply. It forced the world to view Charles not merely as a ruler executing a strategic choice, but as a human being whose entire timeline had been irrevocably bound to the promise of the crown. Reports indicated that historical analysts began re-evaluating his position in the royal lineage almost immediately. They re-examined his unyielding dedication to service, His decades-long advocacy for global causes, his systematic attempts to stabilize the monarchy following years of internal domestic strife, and the quiet adversity of governing during a window marked by personal illness, intense media evaluation, and societal evolution. His era on the throne had never been uncomplicated. It commenced following the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, a monarch whose iconic presence had anchored Britain for generations. Charles inherited not just a physical throne but a permanent standard of comparison that no modern ruler could ever fully escape. Every executive choice was evaluated against his mother's historical shadow. Every public engagement bore the immense weight of continuity. Yet, within that restricted space, he sought to forge a monarchy capable of enduring contemporary pressures without discarding the ancient ethics of obligation, personal restraint, and national devotion. The obstacles encountered were relentless. Domestic fractures remained visible to the public, societal trust demanded constant defense, and the institution was forced to reconcile ancient rituals with an evolving global landscape. Throughout every trial, Charles was required to project absolute fortitude, even when private realities rendered that fortitude exceptionally difficult to perform. It was at this juncture that public sentiment began to undergo a noticeable shift. Individuals who had previously questioned his capability began to perceive the true human cost of the role with greater clarity. They observed not merely systemic privilege, but immense psychological pressure. Not simply grand pageantry, but profound personal sacrifice. Not just a golden crown, but a historical burden passed down through generations. Media discourse pivoted heavily toward legacy, because legacy had become an inescapable reality. Was Charles's ultimate achievement the decades he spent in waiting, the progressive causes he championed, or the institutional equilibrium he sought to protect during one of the court's most delicate historical chapters? The conclusion was far from simple, yet the inquiry itself illustrated how drastically the conversation had shifted. His historic broadcast had effectively transitioned him from a contemporary ruler into an indelible figure of history, even while his personal narrative was actively unfolding. Nevertheless, legacy is never exclusively anchored in historical retrospection. It is fundamentally intertwined with the horizon and the individuals who will carry that institutional accountability forward. With Charles's historic broadcast now reverberating across the country, public focus shifted entirely toward what lay ahead. The crown had navigated severe storms throughout its history, yet every major transition inevitably introduces profound uncertainty. The core question was no longer centered on Charles's impending actions. It revolved around what the subsequent generation would choose to become. This overarching dilemma thrust William and Catherine into the absolute epicenter of a national dialogue they could no longer circumvent. For a prolonged period, they had been viewed as the upcoming public identity of the crown dependable figures standing in the wings of history. However, in the wake of Charles's disclosure, that future felt suddenly immediate, vastly sharper, and infinitely more demanding. The populace was no longer merely observing them as charismatic members of the dynasty. They were evaluating them as living blueprints of what the monarchy must become when the ancient order gives way to a contemporary cadence. Reports indicated that palace strategists recognized this reality instantly. The upcoming epoch could not survive solely on historical tradition, yet it could under no circumstances completely abandon that tradition either. This was the razor-thin tightrope William and Catherine were expected to navigate, sufficiently modern to resonate with a transforming Britain, yet sufficiently traditional to preserve the sacred covenant inherited across generations, accessible enough to appear genuinely human, yet resilient enough to project absolute calm when the surrounding pressure becomes unrelenting. This was far from a mere public relations campaign. It was a fundamental strategy for institutional survival. The societal discourse regarding institutional modernization intensified dramatically because Charles's broadcast converted a distant future into an immediate reality. Certain factions advocated for a streamlined monarchy more concentrated, highly practical, and stripped of peripheral figures and archaic protocols. Conversely, traditionalists harbored anxieties that excessive modification could dilute the mystique that endures as the ultimate source of the crown's authority. William, positioned directly between these competing philosophies, confronted an institutional challenge unlike almost any successor before him. He would not be inheriting a tranquil, unchallenged institution. He would take the reins of a system questioned, scrutinized, critiqued, yet still profoundly embedded within the fabric of national identity. Catherine's strategic positioning became equally vital. Her core strength resided in an innate emotional poise. a pervasive sense that institutional continuity did not have to feel cold or detached. She injected a quieter form of authority into the upcoming vision of the crown, one deeply rooted in domestic life, elegant restraint, and authentic public engagement. Standing alongside William, she provided the institution with a vital conduit connecting historical pageantry with contemporary societal expectations. This conduit was crucial, particularly as younger members of the dynasty would also be forced to determine how they fit within this shifting institutional terrain. Beyond the geographic boundaries of Britain, the international community observed the transition with intense focus. The crown's global reputation depended entirely on whether the transition projected methodical control or systemic ambiguity. Every indicator of internal alignment reinforced global trust, whereas any hint of institutional disorientation invited widespread conjecture. Yet, paradoxically, the historic broadcast simultaneously ignited a renewed global fascination with the institution. Sectors of the populace that had grown indifferent to royal narratives began paying close attention once more. Sensing that tectonic historical shifts were occurring right beneath the surface, the royal terrain was undergoing a profound transformation, not collapsing, not fading away, but fundamentally transforming. And within that transformation, William and Catherine ceased to be distant figures of a future tomorrow. They were actively becoming the living solution to the profound question Charles had quietly presented to the nation. As the nation cast its gaze toward the horizon, a final, foundational truth crystallized from the king's extraordinary broadcast. Certain royal announcements dissolve from public memory with the passage of time, while others solidify into defining turning points of human history. This specific broadcast occupied the latter category not exclusively due to the literal words spoken, but because of what it laid bare regarding the nature of duty, the reality of sacrifice, and the immense burden of wearing the sovereign crown. In the days that followed the event, the profound weight of Charles's choice only intensified in significance. What initially resembled an isolated administrative disclosure evolved into something far more monumental, a critical pivot point in the grand narrative of the monarchy. It exposed a sovereign striving to insulate his historical institution while simultaneously confronting the stark boundaries of his own physical power. It exposed a family compelled to harmonize deeply personal emotions with relentless public expectations. And it reminded a nation that the crown, despite all its majestic pageantry and golden grandeur, is ultimately borne by vulnerable human beings who experience pain, anxiety, and suffering, yet consciously choose the path of duty regardless. The psychological fallout extended far beyond the physical gates of the palace. Citizens debated its long-term meaning. Media analysts dissected every line of text. Loyalists spoke of immense psychological courage, and skeptics questioned what structural changes would follow. Yet, beneath the ambient noise of public discourse, a singular reality remained completely unassailable. Charles had fundamentally transformed the royal narrative. The future could no longer be treated as a distant luxury. William's upcoming trajectory had become explicitly clear. Catherine's institutional position had grown undeniably essential, and the concept of systemic continuity felt more critical than at any previous point in modern memory. This was the quiet, profound power of that specific historical moment. Charles did not need to abdicate the physical crown to completely reshape national expectations. He merely had to openly validate the reality that the monarchy was crossing the threshold into an entirely new phase. Leadership, viewed through this specific lens, was not about manufacturing an illusion that nothing had changed. It was about piloting a nation through profound change while preventing anxiety from seizing control of the narrative. This is precisely where the concept of sacrifice emerged as the absolute core of the entire narrative. Charles had navigated decades of waiting to ascend the throne, yet when the historical moment arrived to elevate the survival of the institution above personal status, he appeared completely prepared to execute that exact sacrifice. For William, the historic broadcast functioned as both an ultimate signal and a stark warning. The future was no longer waiting politely in a distant era. It was rushing toward him with immense historical force. Every executive choice now carried heightened consequences. Every public appearance bore a more profound meaning, and every visible indicator of internal alignment within the dynasty became a vital component of the message the nation desperately required to hear. The monarchy would endure, not because it existed untouched by human suffering, but because it had mastered the ancient art of surviving it. Consequently, a fresh epoch of the crown commenced, characterized not by institutional chaos, but by a deeply controlled solemnity. Charles's ultimate message resonated so profoundly because it was anchored in the oldest institutional lesson of all. The crown is never truly about a single human being. It is fundamentally about sovereign duty passed systematically from hand to hand, generation to generation, through moments of triumph, periods of grief, seasons of silence, and acts of profound sacrifice. Thus, as the grand palace gates swung shut and international headlines continued to flash across the globe, King Charles's historic broadcast transformed into something far greater than routine news. It materialized as the precise moment that defined an entire era and cemented his unique legacy within royal history for all time. Thank you for tuning in today. Please remember to show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel, and we look forward to seeing you in our upcoming feature.